Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk. And so today I'm going to be talking about the effects of composition on the perovskite to post-perovskite transition that occurs in the Earth's mantle. This basically comprises the last two chapters of my PhD thesis that I did with my advisor Dan Shim at MIT. And I want to acknowledge two other co-authors on this project, Brent Grahalski, who's a postdoc in my lab, and Vitaly Prokopenko, who's a beamline scientist at the Advanced Photon Source. And then again, I'd like to acknowledge Krell and the SSGF. It's been a wonderful program to be a part of. So thank you for that. So let's see. Is this not the right one? Oh, wrong one. Okay, so I'll start with a brief outline of my talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of the Earth, since I'm not sure everyone's earth sciences background. You may not have studied it since 6th grade. And talk about the minerals, perovskite, and briefly discuss my experiments, which I do diamond-anvil cell experiments. And then present my results in two different sections, looking at binary and ternary systems and multi-mineral systems. And then I'll discuss some of the geophysical implications for my results. So here we see, this is a basic pie slice through the Earth. And we see the basic compositional makeup of the Earth. And the green area here is the Earth's mantle. It is made up of primarily silicates and oxides. And the different boundary layers we see here in the dark lines are the seismic boundaries that are measured in the Earth. So seismic waves passing through the Earth, different discontinuities in wave speeds. And with those, we use those as a guideline when we're studying the mineralogy of the Earth to try to explain the Earth, explain what these discontinuities are using the mineralogy. So here we have like the 410 kilometer discontinuity and the 660 kilometer discontinuity. These have been explained by phase transitions in the dominant mantle silicate minerals. And then down here, the CMB, that's the core mantle boundary. Here you have a chemical transition going from the rocky silicate mantle into a liquid iron alloy outer core. And then the inner core boundary, we have it's a transition from the liquid outer core into the solid iron inner core. And we know very well from seismology the depths at what these transitions occurs and the pressures those correspond to, and then we translate that back to the mineralogy that we measure in the lab, the stable mineral phase assemblages that we know from our lab work. So what I'm going to focus on in this talk is the D double prime layer. And it's this marked by this discontinuity here. It's in the lower 200 to 400 kilometers of the Earth's mantle. So the D double prime layer is a really interesting region of the Earth. It's so this layer, I said, it's only about 200 to 400 kilometers thick. But it marks the boundary between the liquid iron outer core and the rocky mantle. So you can understand that there'd be a lot of interesting processes happening here. In addition to it being a chemical boundary layer here, we're also, the boundary between like two different chemical compositions, very different chemical compositions. It's also a thermal boundary layer and plays into a lot of the dynamics of the Earth's mantle. So what we know about this D double prime layer, it is marked by a discontinuity in seismic wave speeds, which you see here. We look at the shear wave velocity as a function of depth, and you see these sharp increases in shear wave velocity that, that defines this region. But what's interesting is it's a laterally varying depth for this boundary layer. Also, the wave speeds, the seismic waves passing through it in certain directions are much faster than other directions. So we have anisotropic wave speeds. And then we have these regions of ultra-low velocity layers. And then in addition, what makes this boundary interesting compared to some of those other boundaries that I showed is that it doesn't seem to occur globally in the Earth. So here we see a map of the Earth where the blue areas show regions where this D double prime discontinuity is observed, and the red areas mark regions where it is not observed to exist. And then other areas are just unsampled regions. So in 2004, perovskite. It's the magnesium silicate perovskite is a mineral that's thought to make up about 80% of the Earth's lower mantle. So it's a hugely abundant mineral. It was found to undergo a structural phase transition at 125 gigapascals, which corresponds to a couple hundred kilometers above the core mantle boundary to the so-called post-perovskite phase. And you see they're both orthorhombic structures, but this one's a network structure, this one's a layered structure. You can understand how they have very different properties. And so this pressure is coincident with where we see the D double prime layer. So now we have an explanation that we can use for this discontinuity. This perovskite to post-perovskite phase transition can possibly be used to explain the D double prime discontinuity. So to be able to explain the discontinuity, there's a bunch of observable features that observe the D double prime region that we need to be able to explain using the post-perovskite transition. So the seismic discontinuity itself can be explained using the phase transition. So there's a density change that occurs at the phase transition, which causes an increase in the wave speeds passing through it. The anisotropy that I talked about, because of the layered structure of post-perovskite, when you deform it, it can align and get a crystallographic preferred orientation, and that allows for wave speeds to pass faster in certain directions compared to others. We have the ultra-low velocity zones. Those have been proposed to be explained by extremely iron-rich phases of the post-perovskite. And then we come back to this intermittent detection of D double prime, and its varying depth. And so again, here's this map that demonstrates how it's only intermittently detectable. And the model for this that was proposed is based on temperature variations in the lowermost mantle above the core. So as I mentioned earlier, this region it's a thermal boundary layer. So the core is much hotter than the mantle. So we get this we can get these steep temperature profiles coming through here. And so here we're looking at basically it's kind of like a schematic of a phase diagram for the perovskite and post-perovskite. So we're looking at depth here on the y-axis and temperature on the x-axis, and this red line marks the phase change going from perovskite to post-perovskite. These different lines here show potential geotherms, so potential temperature profiles down here. So if you have an especially hot geotherm, you see that you never actually pass into the post-perovskite phase. If you have a colder geotherm, you pass in, or you can see how a temperature going from cold to warm can change the depth that this transition would occur. And there's also the possibility of back transforming it into the perovskite phase. So in the Earth, we have subducting material that is formed at the surface. It passes down into the Earth. It's colder and denser and drops down to the bottom. So maybe you have regions that are colder, and then you also have these hot upwellings, like regions under Hawaii they're hot spots that produce volcanoes at the Earth's surface. So those are maybe coming from regions that are hotter. So in this model, you can see that maybe in the hot regions, you never get post-perovskite, and in the cold regions, you do get post-perovskite. So perhaps this can explain why up here you do see it, and maybe down here you don't see it. That's kind of the idea for explaining this. The problem with this is this model's for pure magnesium silicate. The Earth is not pure magnesium silicate. We at least have to worry about the iron and aluminum and how those would affect these phase transitions, not to mention a multitude of other things, but we can get slightly more complicated here than just looking at the magnesium silicate. So what most of my PhD thesis has been looking at both perovskite and post-perovskite and looking at compositional effects on elasticity, spin transitions, and then the phase transitions in going from perovskite to post-perovskite. So, so here we see the structure of post-perovskite again. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this earlier. Here we have silicon oxygen octahedra, and then we have magnesium atoms in between in these layers. And you can actually substitute ferrous iron, ferric iron, and aluminum in for the magnesium. And you can substitute aluminum and ferric iron in for the silicon. And this can affect the phase diagram. So it can affect the perovskite to post-perovskite transition, at what depth these transitions occur. And it can also broaden the transition. So you can get a region where you get both phases coexisting in equilibrium at the same time. So now I'm going to come back to a slightly more detailed cross-section of the Earth. We're looking here at just the mantle. On the left, we have depth versus different seismic parameters. So we have density, shear wave velocity, and P wave, or compressional wave velocity. And on the right here, we can look at mineralogy, looking at the volume fraction of the minerals that make up the Earth here. And we can relate this mineralogy to what we see in the seismology. So like I said before, we have these seismic discontinuities. We have increases here in seismic wave speed, which can be related to increases in density, and we can explain those by changes in the bulk mineralogy that we're seeing here. But there are some interesting parameters we can look at here. So in terms of the 660 discontinuity occurring at 660 kilometers here, the seismic discontinuity is measured to be less than 2 kilometers thick. So we know the transition, it's a very discrete jump in velocity here that occurs over less than 2 kilometers. And then we look at the mineral ringwoodite transforming to perovskite and ferropericlase. And this can explain this very well. In this transition, the pressure range that this occurs over corresponds to less than 2 kilometers. So it explains that very well. And then for comparison, we can look at the pyroxene to garnet transition. And this actually occurs at a pressure range that corresponds to a depth of over 200 kilometers. So in this case, we don't actually see a discontinuity here. We instead see a gradient in the velocity profile here. And then if we look down at the D double prime discontinuity, seismically it's been constrained to be less than 70 kilometers. So if we want to be able to explain this with the mineralogy, we have to have compositions, compositions that make sense for the Earth, for perovskite and post-perovskite, that can explain this thickness, that have sharp enough transitions that can be used to explain this. So I do my experiments using a diamond-anvil cell. It's basically 2 opposing gem quality, brilliant cut, internally flawless, natural quarter-carat diamonds. And they're placed inside the cell. It can fit in the palm of your hand, which just pressure is controlled by turning these screws here. There's 4 screws around the top. And so pressure is force over area. Instead of using a huge force, instead we're using a very, very tiny area to work with here. So here's just a schematic of it. So the diamonds, their tips are truncated to a flat area that for these experiments is between 50 and 150 microns in diameter. And our samples, well, the diamonds are wonderful to use because they are transparent to a wide range of wavelengths of light. So we can have our sample at pressure and then pass X-rays through it. We can do different forms of spectroscopy. We can use infrared laser beams to heat up our sample. And so you see here is my sample. It's a powdered starting material that's mixed with gold, which I use as a pressure standard, and then it's pressed into this little platelet and then surrounded by argon or neon, which acts as both a pressure medium, so it distributes the pressure as well through the sample, and it insulates the sample from the diamonds, which are extremely thermally conductive and are just basically a heat sink if you're trying to heat your sample up. And then it's surrounded in the radial direction by a rhenium gasket. And we increase pressure this way, and we also sample it with X-rays and lasers in this radial direction, or axial direction, sorry. So again, here's another. All of my measurements have been performed at the Advanced Photon Source at Argonne National Lab. We use synchrotron radiation to do X-ray diffraction on these samples. And here you can see a schematic of the diamond cell. We have the synchrotron radiation coming in from one end of the diamond cell, and out the other side we measure X-ray diffraction from our sample. And simultaneously co-aligned with the laser beam is, or co-aligned with the X-ray beam is an infrared laser that we use to heat up the sample to 2,000 to 3,000 Kelvin generally. So we're simultaneously at very high pressures and high temperatures and taking X-ray diffraction patterns to measure what the stable phase assemblage is in the sample under those conditions. So I'm going to split up the talk into two parts, looking at the perovskite to post-perovskite transition, PV to PPV. So the first part is about the ternary and binary systems, and the second part will be multi-mineral systems. So my starting materials are homogeneous glasses that, again, I powder up and put in the sample. And I'm going to look at three compositions here. So we're going to look at the effect of ferric iron by looking at magnesium silicate and Fe2O3 together. And then we're going to look at ferric iron and aluminum together. And then we're also going to use a natural enstatite crystal here to look at the effect of ferrous iron and see how these compositional variations affect the thickness of the phase transition between perovskite and post-perovskite. So here's a sample X-ray diffraction pattern for you. The bottom axis is essentially inverse D-spacing, and then on the y-axis, just intensity. We have three representative X-ray diffraction patterns here, where the red dots denote post-perovskite, the high-pressure phase, and the blue dots show the diffraction peaks for perovskite. So we're basically just kind of think of this as a fingerprinting technique. So here we're at 134 gigapascals and 2500 Kelvin. And you see we have a mixed phase between both perovskite and post-perovskite. If we increase pressure ever so slightly, we pass over the phase boundary and lose all diffraction lines from perovskite, and here we see just post-perovskite, and then we can pass back over the phase boundary again by decreasing pressure, and then again we see the reappearance of perovskite diffraction lines. So we use this technique to map out the phase boundary for the post-perovskite transition. So here we see this phase boundary where we're looking at temperature on the y-axis and pressure on the x-axis, or elevation above the core mantle boundary. Blue shows the stability field for perovskite only, red for post-perovskite only, and green shows the mixed phase region where we have both perovskite and post-perovskite coexisting. The arrows to the left show measurements that are taken on decompression, and to the right show measurements that are taken on compression. And for reference here, this dotted line is a phase boundary for pure magnesium silicate. So if there's no iron in the sample, we just get one discrete line showing the phase boundary between the two phases. But you see here, we actually have a phase boundary that's about 400 kilometers thick. So if you recall before, seismically, the phase boundary must be less than 70 kilometers. So you can tell already that this does not explain the D double prime discontinuity. So if we move on and we look at ferric iron in the sample instead of ferrous iron, so we're looking at the trivalent, and this sample actually has twice as much iron as the last boundary. And then we can move on to combined ferric iron and aluminum, and instead of that narrow phase boundary we saw with just the ferric iron, we have a very broad boundary. So just to kind of summarize that and plot this with other groups' work, here we're looking at pressure on the y-axis and then different compositions, both experimental results and other groups' computational results on these systems. And we see that aluminum-free systems, they tend to have pretty broad boundaries, but at lower pressures, so they're higher above the core mantle boundary. And when you include aluminum in the system, systematically you see much broader boundaries that are pushed to greater depths. And this agrees qualitatively with what's been seen in computational work on this phase transition. And again, the seismic boundary is about that thick. So you see we're not really explaining that with any of these compositions. So we want to move on to multi-mineral systems. Since the Earth is not all made up of one mineral down there, there are other phases that could be influencing this phase transition. So for example, basically the experiments I just showed you where basically this is what the phase diagram would kind of look like. If you're varying composition down here, you have this two-phase loop. And if you have to keep composition of the low pressure phase equal to the high pressure phase, so you have this fixed range where both phases coexist. But if you add in the effect of a third phase, it can vary the composition. It can affect the composition of that phase that's undergoing the transition. So instead of staying here, the third phase allows you can, like, for example, decrease the iron content of the phase that's undergoing the transition, and this would narrow the boundary significantly. And this has been seen before in, so I discussed the 410 discontinuity earlier. That is alpha spinel or olivine to wadzillite or beta spinel phase transition. Where here, if there's no other phase present in the system, you follow this path here, and you have this broader boundary. But if you include garnet in the system, it kind of sucks up some of the iron and moves you this way compositionally, and you can have a much narrower phase boundary. So this is, we're looking for this effect now with the post-perovskite transition. And a slight review on plate tectonics. So the Earth isn't homogeneous like I showed in that first slide. We have these processes happening at the surface of the Earth where we have, say, mid-ocean ridges where there's partial melting of the Earth or of the mantle here that's causing differentiation of materials, and this creates the oceanic lithosphere, so basically the crust beneath the oceans. And they have this profile here where there's this rock basalt is at the very surface, and then this rock Harzburgite. And then pyrolite here is a rock, it's a theoretical rock that represents a mixing of like 1 part of basalt to 3 parts Harzburgite, and it's been proposed as the composition of the mantle itself, so the Earth's mantle. If the Earth's mantle was, all the stuff got remixed, the Earth's mantle would be made of pyrolite. And in a lot of areas in my field, people just kind of accept that the Earth is just pyrolite, all down there. It's all just homogeneous pyrolite. So, but what we actually have is this, oceanic lithosphere, this slab, when it collides with continental crust, it's much denser and colder than the continental crust, or not necessarily colder, but it's much denser than the continental crust, so it subducts beneath it and enters back into the Earth. And this is what you see like up in the Cascade volcanoes in like Washington and Oregon. The oceanic crust is subducting underneath North America, and that's causing volcanoes like Mount St. Helens. And so these are the rock compositions that we're actually curious about, because if these are going back into the Earth, there's the potential that they could actually still exist as these rocks down in the lowermost mantle. And then, of course, we're also interested in how the post-perovskite transition looks in pyrolite, since it's proposed as a homogeneous mantle. A lot of people assume that the lower mantle just is this rock. So we can look at just kind of a breakdown of the mineralogy of these 3 phases. Pyrolite, it's going to be mostly magnesium silicate with about 1/3 ferropericlase. Ferropericlase is about, it's MgO basically, magnesium oxide with iron in it. Harzburgite has a larger ferropericlase component. And then basalt, instead of being saturated in magnesium oxide, it's saturated in silicon oxide, silicon dioxide. And you also have these other 2 phases here. And so they also have very different compositions in terms of chemical composition, where the basalt has a lot more alumina in it, and again, it has a lot less magnesium and more silicon. So we want to see how all of these play into the post-perovskite transition. So here's an example of diffraction patterns again. And it's basically the same thing I showed before, with just the addition that we have these open circles here denote the ferropericlase in the sample, which is into the transition. And what we see in this San Carlos olivine, which is an approximation of the Harzburgite rock, we see an extremely narrow transition. And this is the result of this ferropericlase phase sucking up the iron here and actually narrowing this transition significantly. And then we look at the pyrolitic composition, which is again is the homogeneous mantle composition. We see the pressure range where this occurs is likely greater than the depth of the core mantle boundaries, so this transition does not occur in the Earth, and it's a very, very broad transition, so it wouldn't even be seismically detectable if it was occurring in the Earth. And this is because although it has somewhere for the iron to go in the ferropericlase, there's aluminum in the system that has to stay in the magnesium silicate. And then just to quickly show the basalt composition, the whole point of this is to just show you it's a very, very messy sample. There are 6 phases that are potentially coexisting here. And So it's a little more to deal with, but we get a relatively narrow boundary, where I just want to point out there's a lower and an upper boundary on this because it's not as well constrained. But this is interesting that this is much narrower because it has so much more aluminum in it. And I showed earlier, aluminum really broadens the transition. And this is because the aluminum can enter the silica and this calcium ferrite type phase, and also the iron can enter this calcium ferrite type phase. So even though the bulk composition has so much alumina in it and so much iron, there are other phases it can enter into, so it doesn't broaden the transition in that same way. So just kind of summarizing this all together, I'm going to look again at the elevation from the core mantle boundary, and look at this in aluminum-free systems, aluminum-bearing systems, and then these multi-mineral systems. And we see this San Carlos olivine has this relatively narrow transition occurring just above the core mantle boundary. And this is, This is compared to what we measured in the single component system, where these have the same iron content, but this is the effect of the ferropericlase is to narrow the boundary compared to this. And then we look at the aluminum bearing systems, and the pyrolite agrees well with these, where you just get a very broad, very deep transition. And then the basaltic composition, it's a shallower transition and probably not as sharp as the San Carlos olivine. So again, these have low aluminum, this has a lot of aluminum, this has a lot of aluminum, but the aluminum has another phase to enter. So aluminum is really what's controlling the broadness of these boundaries. And then coming back to the seismic transition, it's about 70 kilometers here, and you can see we're relatively close for these two compositions, but the homogeneous mantle composition really does not explain the seismic results. And so, again, kind of summarize this, instead of simplifying it to just being cold regions and hot regions, you can actually still use this graph and say that it's regions where we have these subducted materials accumulating. That's where we're seeing the post-perovskite transition. That's where we're seeing the D double prime discontinuity. And these regions where that material isn't accumulating, it's probably pyrolitic, and therefore that's why you're not seeing the transition. But you can't really explain it simply as temperature because there's a lot more chemical compositions having a much larger effect here. And I just want to kind of show that we do have evidence for this. This is a tomographic image, seismic image of the Earth's mantle, where this is a subducting slab. So we see this oceanic lithosphere subducting down into the lowermost mantle, and also some geodynamic modeling, which shows that as you go deeper in the Earth, you get a larger basaltic composition that's been accumulating down there over the age of the Earth due to its greater density because of its mineralogy and temperature. And so just coming to, there's been many different models for having a heterogeneous Earth, and that's really what our results are suggesting, and that's really how people need to be thinking about the Earth, is it's much more heterogeneous, and that you can't just simplify it into a homogeneous mantle. And detailed seismic studies, which are now being done, these is just showing depth above the core mantle boundary along some distance under China, where these black little blips here are showing basically discontinuities that they're seeing. And they're seeing a weaker, shallow discontinuity and a stronger, deeper discontinuity that could potentially be explained by these two different rock compositions here. And so in summary, the depth and thickness of the post-perovskite boundary is highly dependent on composition and mineralogy, and the D double prime discontinuity may only occur in the Earth where subducted materials have accumulated near the core mantle boundary. Thank you.